All right, I think we are on Facebook and on YouTube and on all of our sites. Give me just a minute to share it to a couple of places. Then we'll start. If you've got your Bibles and you want to go ahead and turn there, or you want your paper, we're going to be in Exodus 16 tonight. Exodus chapter 16 is where we're going to go and where we're going to look at the next part of Moses and the Israelites. They are going, they're out of the Red Sea. We talked last week about them crossing the Red Sea. And so now we're going to talk about them. Now we're going to talk about them after they've got through the Red Sea and through on to the other side of what God is doing with them. So give me just a second here. All right, let me close this. All right, I think we are ready to go. We are, as I said, in Exodus chapter 16 tonight. I think I may have said 19 a couple times. I meant 16. We are in Exodus 16. We are going to be studying the next part. As I said, this is what most people think to be probably a month after the the crossing of the Red Sea. They have been in the wilderness for probably we assume a month, and I'll tell you about that in just a second, I believe, if I remember that part. And so we're seeing Israel on the other side, and the thing about it is we see Israel on this other side, but yet we still see Israel having some of the problems that Israel's going to have throughout its existence, and that is they're doubting God. But Exodus 16. We'll start in the first 3 verses and we'll talk about it. It says, they have set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So notice what they're doing here. The people have come out of Egypt. They are in the wilderness, and they are beginning to complain. Now we start here where they set out from Elim. We really, again, don't know, like these other places, we don't know where Elim is. We have no idea where this is, but they've traveled out of Elim, and they're on their way to Sinai. They're in that Sinai Peninsula, and they're traveling in between Elim and Sinai, and they're in this wilderness of Sin. Now this wilderness of Sin is just the name of the place. It's probably the wilderness where Sinai was at the outskirts, because Sinai is in its name, but they were not at Sinai itself. They were still, again, we're not sure how far out, but they were probably a week or so from Sinai, not more, and they're traveling. And so they're in this wilderness. And again, the wilderness here is not our wilderness. It's not woods. It's desert. They're wandering out here in this desert, and they've already had the problem of almost running out of water. And so now they they have the problem of food. And this is what we see. They have departed from the land of Egypt. And you notice what I said has been probably a month, is it says on the 15th day of the 2nd month. If we take the description of the Passover as God told them to do it in future generations, and assume that that's when he did it the first time, we know that Passover was to be eaten on the 14th day of the first month. And so what that does is that if they had Passover on the 14th day, when they typically did, then this is the 15th day of the 2nd month. This typically makes us think that there's been a month. They've been out in this wilderness for a month, and it's probably to be expected. They have traveled. They left in a hurry. They weren't able to prepare. They weren't able to prepare their bread. Remember, they had to eat unleavened bread because they didn't even have time to let it leaven and to cook it. And so here they are wandering out in the wilderness. And as they wander, the whole people come to Moses. Now, this is one of the interesting things in verse 2, is that this is one of the times when the whole group, not just a part, not just a couple here or there, not just a certain rabble of them, but the whole congregation, everybody in Israel begins to grumble. They begin to complain against Moses and Aaron about how bad it is, how horrible it is where they are. And you notice it says they set out and they went to Moses and Aaron, and this is what they said. They said, would we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt? Basically saying, why couldn't we have died in that 10th plague rather than to be out here and be starving and to be starving to death? And we can probably understand that. This is something that we see in other countries, other nations, other people, and other times that we may not relate to as well. But that idea of going without food, of being hungry, of starving. We say that we're hungry. We say we're starving, but we're not really starving. For a lot of us, it wouldn't hurt us to miss a couple meals. Wouldn't hurt us to miss a couple of snacks. Here, these people were in the wilderness. They have run out of supplies. Again, whatever supplies they had, you got 2 million people here plus, and they're out of supplies. They've run out of everything they had, and they're all starving. They're all dying. They barely can find water. Now they're having trouble with food, and they come to Moses and say, "Oh, why didn't God just kill us in Egypt? Why did God bring us out here? Why did this happen to us?" And then notice what they said. Now, this is the interesting thing about their statement in the middle part of that verse. Why didn't we just die in the land of Egypt when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full? They're having fond memories of Egypt that they didn't have there. You ever know people do this, and this is typical, people do this. You ever know someone to be out of a bad situation and be out of a bad spot, and they reminisce about that bad spot, but they don't remember the bad times, they just remember the good times? That's what Israel's doing. Or they're remembering Egypt in the rose-colored glasses. They're remembering it because they had food. All they're thinking about now is the food that was great is what they're saying. We had food and food to spare. Yes, but you were a slave. Yes, but you were doing work and you were sweating. You were having all kinds of issues there. But that doesn't matter. We have food. And so here's Israel's focus is the food. And then again, they make this statement. This is what's interesting to me. Usually make this, I think, all the way from Exodus 15 all the way to Deuteronomy. Moses, you brought us out in this wilderness to kill us. They said it on the other side of the Red Sea. They said it when they were without water. They said it when they were without food. They're going to say it multiple times over. Was there not enough graves in Egypt for you to kill us, die there? You brought us all out here into this wilderness to starve to death. They were putting on a show, and they were over-exaggerating what Egypt was like, and they were under-exaggerating what God had did. They were forgetting. They were forgetful people. And so Moses speaks to the people in verse 4. God comes to Moses to tell them what to do. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, at evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us? And Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. And so what we do is God comes to Moses, and God says, okay, Moses, I'm gonna test the people. Now notice this. God says again, I'm going to test them. I'm going to try them. I'm going to see if they'll listen to me. And God's done this before. Remember with the water, he said, I'm going to test them to see if they'll listen, see what they'll do, if they'll hold true to me, if they'll obey my word. Well, what word? The word here is about the manna, where God speaks to them about this manna that's going to come from heaven. And we'll talk a little bit about manna in just a few minutes. This bread that's going to rain from heaven that they're going to pick every morning. And again, he says, I'm going to test them, whether or not they're going to listen to me. Well, test them on what? Well, the idea was that they should go out every day and gather a day's portion. You were only to gather so much that you needed. And we're going to see a little bit later that God gave specific instructions, or Moses gave specific instructions of how much you were to gather. And then you notice he says, but on the 6th day, when you prepare to bring it in, you're bringing twice as much. Now, here's something very interesting about this that we may not understand, may not catch, may not recognize, is that this is the first reference in the Bible, to a Sabbath day. It's the first reference. Somehow, even today, we'll still claim the Sabbath is a holy day, that the Sabbath day was a day set aside for God, a day that mankind ought to rest. Yes, that day is rooted, it is grounded in the creation story, in the creation account, but the Sabbath was not observed until Exodus 15 or 16. This is the first place, and it's not really here that we see it called the Sabbath. It's not until a little later in this chapter that God's going to say the seventh day is a Sabbath. And then it's after this, and about Exodus 20 and the 10 Commandments, when God's going to say, remember the Sabbath and keep it. So this is another thing that's going to be interesting that's going to bring in, and God sort of hints of what the Sabbath's going to be like. Because he says on the sixth day, you're going to gather twice as much. You're going to gather twice as much as you usually do. And then you're going to have plenty so that on the seventh day, you don't have to work. Now, God doesn't explain to them here what this is about, but God tells them what to do. Then verse 6, Moses and Aaron go tell all the people. And again, they tell them at evening, when evening comes, you're going to know. You're going to know that God is the one who brought you out of Egypt, because God's going to do something. God's going to respond. And not only is he going to respond in the evening, he's also going to respond in the morning. And he says he's going to do this for he has heard your grumbling. He's a God who hears. He's a God who listens, a God who responds. And he says he's heard your grumbling against him. And then he knows the end of verse 7, Moses and Aaron said, for what are we? What are we that you grumble against us? What makes us important that you want to come and complain to us? We're not the ones who brought you out here. We're not the ones able to do these things. It is God. And so Moses is going to reiterate here over and over that God is the one that you're grumbling against. God is the one you're complaining against, not us, not human. And then you notice he again says in verse 8, he reemphasizes that God's going to give you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full. Again, he's going to do this because God has heard your grumbling. God has heard the grumbling you've had. God's heard about your complaints, and he's going to do something about it. And he says, again, you're not grumbling against us, you're grumbling against God. And God's going to use this as a test, a trial, to see how Israel will respond, to see how they will listen to what he has to say. Then we get into verse 9. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, I've heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So again, Moses and Aaron, now this is a question if this is the same time he just got through talking to them, or if this is a later meeting. We're really not sure in the context. It doesn't tell us how many times they met with the people, but basically Moses and Aaron are with the people again. Moses tells Aaron to call all the people, bring them together, to come near before God, where he's heard you. God's about to do something. And then you notice verse 10, as soon as the congregation gets together, they look out in the distance, they look out away from them, and they see a cloud. They see the glory of the Lord appear in a cloud. Now, exactly what this glory of the Lord is, we don't know. This is sort of foreshadowing what's going to happen in a few chapters, but it's also glancing back to what's already happened. Remember, we already told that God has been leading Israel at night or during the day as a cloud. He's been leading them with this cloud that's his presence that tells them when to go and when to stop. This cloud that saved them or stalled the Egyptians where they were able to cross the Red Sea, or the Israelites, excuse me. And now he's going to come and they're going to see this cloud is not just a regular cloud. This is something of significance. And this is also going to point to the future, in that in Exodus 20:21, when God comes and gives the 10 Commandments and the law of Moses, he descends in a cloud upon Mount Sinai and settles there. And he's going to speak from that cloud. And then later at the end of this book, when he settles on the tabernacle, he descends upon the tabernacle at that point, and they get it built and it's consecrated to him. He's going to again settle as a cloud, as a sign of his presence. And so basically God comes down in this cloud that is noticeable that this is God. And he calls Moses to him and he speaks to Moses. Now, the idea is he's speaking directly to Moses, but he's speaking so that everyone else can hear. He wants Israel to know what he's about to say. And you notice he again reemphasizes, this is about the third time he's reemphasized, or him and Moses reemphasized, that meat's coming at night and bread's coming in the morning. And again, he says at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Now, the interesting thing about this is the last part of this verse, where God says, verse 12, then you shall know that I am the Lord, Yahweh, your God. What's interesting to me about that is that statement that this will be done, that then you'll know who I am, is the same statement God had made all through the 10 plagues. All through the 10 plagues, all through the crossing of the Red Sea, God has told Israel and told Egypt, or told Moses, that he's doing these things so that Egypt and Israel can know who God is. Egypt got the point. Egypt understood when God finally did the Red Sea and crushed them. They understood. Israel still does not understand who God is and what God is capable of. And God says, I'm going to do this so they can know that I'm going to take care of them. Again, he wants them to know that he brought them out here. He's not going to leave them die. He's not going to abandon them, but he is going to save them. He is going to care for them. He is going to protect them if they will trust him and listen to him and obey him. Then we go on from there to verse 13. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each of you, as much as he can eat. You shall take each an omer, according to the number of persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. All right, let's stop right there and see what happens. Now, the first part is the meat. The meat is the quail. What's interesting about the meat is in this section, the meat is not really covered. Now, we're going to see later this quail is going to come again. That's something I want you to understand about this that we sometimes wonder about. This promise of food, the quail was only a few time occurrence. The quail was not a daily thing. The quail was not a daily occurrence. They didn't daily have food or daily have meat. Let me put it that way. They were having food that they had this meat that came from the quail at certain times. Now, going back to their food, some people say, well, they had meat. Well, they had animals. Why didn't they just kill the animals? Well, the idea was, by the way they talked, and I should have mentioned earlier, is that the Israelites may have killed killed some of the animals that were extra, but they left they had to leave some of their animals because they had to have what's called mixing or breeding pairs, breeding animals. And so they needed those animals that were still alive, because if they ate all the animals, then they'd surely die. And again, they had to have the goats and the cows for the milk and the cheese and butter and all that. Again, they would have probably done goat milk more than what we do, cow milk. But the meat had to be from an outside source. And so here we have the quail. Now, what's interesting about the quail here is that there's half a verse given to quail. But there is the majority of this chapter given to the manna. Well, why? Because this is something that's going to happen on a daily basis. The quail was just an occasional happening. And we're going to see later when God brings the quail back that we're going to get more detail about the quail. But in the evening, that evening, quail came. The people were starving. The people were at their wits' end. God sends meat to them. He sends meat first, and then he sends bread. Now, the other thing that I want you to notice and to remember that we may forget, may not think about, is in their time, they did not, their meals weren't like ours. Most of their meals were what we joke about, bread and water. Bread and water, maybe cheese. Very rarely did the common people have meat. Typically, you only had meat if it was a sacrifice to your God or if it was a feast, a celebration. Not very often. It wasn't like us where we have meat. I think I've had meat 3 meals a day. Not 3 meals this day. They didn't have that. They had milk, or they had bread, and they had vegetables, and even vegetables were depending on the season. And so this is why the quail wasn't a daily occurrence, because they weren't used to that. And God knew they could survive on the bread. And so what happened is that the quail came in the evening, and they had the quail, and in the morning there was this dew. And this dew in verse 14 comes down, and it goes down on the earth. When the dew dries up, there's this left behind this fine flake thing. Again, these words that are used are generic. They don't really give us a lot of detail. It's some kind of white, maybe powder, white flakes, white chunks that was left on the ground. And again, notice it was a flake thing, like a frost on the ground. And when the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" What's interesting about this is that they're giving this bread a name. In Hebrew, the phrase, the question, "What is it?" is one word. It's manhu. Manhu is what is it? Well, our words, what the translators later did is they transliterated those words. In the Greek, the word is manna. And so our English word manna comes from Greek. It comes from Hebrew. That basically means, what is it? What is it? That's what the name manna was what is it? And they come to Moses and they see this. They say, well, what is this? And Moses gives them instruction. And Moses says, it's the bread. Is the bread that God is giving you to eat. And again, the idea is that this is a powder. This is a powder that can be baked, can be boiled, can be fixed in different ways, can be eaten plain. We're going to see some references as we go through this chapter of some different ways to fix manna. But now he's going to tell them about the commands of God. He says, notice here, each one of you, you're going to gather each day as much as you can eat. And he says you should take an omer. Now, an omer is a ancient measurement. Wasn't commonly used. It's about the only time in the Old Testament I believe this word is used as omer. But basically, the best equivalent we have is this is about 2 quarts or 1.5 liters. And this was a 1.5 liters or 2 quarts of this flake. That was good enough for a person. And he says you should take an omer according to the number of the persons that each one of you has in his tent. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. God is very specific here. God is very specific in what he's doing in this blessing, in this manna. He is providing just enough manna for everybody in the company. He's got this either, like say, 1.5, 2 million people. There's enough for 1 omer each. Exactly. There's no leftover. There's no overabundance. There's no shortage. It's perfect. How do we know that? Well, notice the next few verses. Notice some of the people of Israel did so. They just got the omer. And then there's some this group here, I don't think they did this on purpose. Some gathered, they gathered, some more, some less. Again, I don't think they had the little cup out there of an omer and were leveling it off. They were gathering what they could, because again, this is the first time it's ever happened. We don't know if this is happening again, so we're making sure we're going to get as close as we can. And again, some people got more, some people got less. But then notice verse 18, the miraculous part of this is that when they got back and they measured it, no matter what they got, if they got more than enough or they got a little less than an omer, or more than an omer, a little less than an omer, when they got back to the tents to measure it, it was an omer. All of it was an omer. Everyone who gathered, it was the same level. And therefore, the one who had much, the one who gathered much had none left over. The one who gathered little didn't have any lack. That they gathered as much as they got. They gathered what they were supposed to do. And so God made sure this was perfect balance. This was perfect there. And then you notice the next part, verse 19 through 21. And Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over until the morning. But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. Notice this, verse 19, Moses tells them there's one other condition about this. One other thing, you've got to gather it every morning. You only gather an omer. And two, well, probably three, he says, don't leave any. When you eat it, when you gather it, when you gather for that day, you eat what you've got for that day. Don't leave any over. Don't leave it. And then you see the natural curiosity of people. And this is maybe a natural reaction. I can understand this reaction. This was part of God's test to these people, whether or not they would listen to him. Knowing some ladies that I know, especially some older ladies from my family and my past, I could see them doing this very thing. I could see a lot of people doing what these people do. They didn't listen to him. Moses said, don't worry, this manna is going to be big. Every morning you're going to have this manna. Well, the first day this manna shows up, you've been without food. I can see the good old mother, the good old grandmother saying, hey, we don't eat all that. We're going to have some left over. We're going to have it for tomorrow, just in case God forgets, just in case God doesn't do what Moses said. We will make sure we got some left over. We will make sure we've got some for tomorrow. And what this does is to us, it sounds like common sense, but what they're doing is they're actually testing God. They're not being faithful to God. God told them this was going to be there every day. They should have had the faith, the trust to believe that. And we can see the human tendency not to accept that. And so they take it. They leave part of it. And then you notice in the morning it breeds worms. Some translations say maggots. It breeds worms and stinks. It just is worthless. And Moses finds out about it. You can imagine the reaction of the people in the morning waking up and finding worms in this bread they collected the day before. And it's ruined. And it has this horrible smell, and the people are probably trying to figure out what to do with it. Moses finds out they didn't do what he said to do, what God commanded. And Moses is furious. But the interesting thing about this that's interesting to me, Moses is furious with them, but we don't hear about God being furious with them. We don't hear God wanting to punish Israel for this. If this was a punishable offense, they showed their lack of faith in God, but God never steps forward and says, okay, you did wrong. Here's your punishment. I think God knew they were going to do this. I think God understood they were going to test him. This was part of the test. This was, again, part of the test, whether or not they would listen to him. And then the next thing about this man in verse 21 is they gathered it every day, each as much as he could eat. But they would, whatever they didn't eat, or excuse me, whatever they didn't gather, when the sun grew hot, when the dew had melted away, and it was left that they didn't gather it, when the first thing in the morning, it melted. It was gone. It disappeared. Now, again, remember, they couldn't gather more than the omer. They couldn't gather more than they wanted, more than they were commanded. And if they didn't gather it, it was their fault, and therefore it was gone. So God, this is interesting to me about this, and I think this too speaks to God, is that God provided for them the ability to do this, but God also gave them a responsibility. It wasn't that the manna was there and it just stayed there all day. You just went and did as you pleased. No, they had very specific instructions. They were told how much to gather. They were told when to gather, and they were told what to do with it. To eat it that day and not leave any left over. And they had to eat it before the sun went up. They had to get up and do it. And if they didn't do it, then it was their fault. And so here God continues to take care of them. And then we continue to look at this, what God does. Now, verse 22 and following, the next little part, next few verses, I should say, God's going to introduce a new concept to them. And that is the Sabbath day. Notice what he says. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation come and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil. And all that is left over lay aside to be kept until the morning. So they laid it aside until the morning, as Moses commanded them. And it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord is giving you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each one of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. So we go back here to verse 22. And on the sixth day of the week, on Friday, they were commanded to gather twice as much as they normally did. Gather twice, gather 2 omers instead of 1. And what they're going to do is they're going to keep it till the next day. Well, the people do this, and the leaders of Israel come to Moses. Now, this is part of 22. The leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, and they said, "Moses, the people are gathering more than they're supposed to." They're concerned about this. And again, I don't quite understand if they didn't grasp the concept or what. It's very odd that the people knew to gather twice as much, but the leaders didn't do that. Or maybe the leaders were coming to Moses and saying, "Are you sure we can gather twice as much? Are you sure that we can do this?" And Moses says, yes. He says, basically says, yes, this is what you're supposed to do. He said, tomorrow is a solemn day of rest, a day of solemn rest, a day of serious rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. What's interesting about this, and I've not thought about this until I got to studying for tonight, is there are some people we still see today who try to say and try to teach that the Sabbath is still the holy day today, that the Sabbath is the holy day because it was granted from creation. That is not true. That is not true, because here we have in Exodus 16 that the people of Israel are commanded to celebrate this Sabbath day, but yet when they started it, they had no clue about what it was. If the Sabbath day was something that had been going on from creation to this time, as some people try to claim, the Israelites would have understood what it was doing. But from this context, the Israelites have no clue what the Sabbath day is. They don't understand the concept. And so Moses says the seventh day is going to be a day of Sabbath. The Sabbath is the Hebrew word for Sabbath. It means rest. And he says you're going to take a day of rest. And again, this is foreshadowing a few chapters. This is foreshadowing what's coming. And what I mean is 10 Commandments. When God says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. There's a foreshadowing of what's coming, as we said earlier as well. But he says this is a holy Sabbath. And here we get another idea of what they did with this manna. Notice he says, bake what you'll bake and boil what you'll boil. So that they would take this manna and they would eat it raw. They would also bake it into bread or cakes. They would boil it and they would cook it that way. And he said that at the end of that day, lay aside what's left over. Lay it aside and keep it till the next day. I wonder how many of those mamas, again, I hate this is Matt's thought. I wonder how many of those mamas and grandmamas who on Monday laid extra aside, made sure they had some left over, and then found that stuff stinking up the house on Tuesday and with worms in it on Tuesday. I wonder by Friday how many of those that Moses said, hey, gather twice as much. You're going to have to use the extra you gather on Friday, you're going to use on Saturday. I'm wondering how many of those mothers, those grandmothers, were fretting getting up Saturday morning to see that stuff was stinking. I wonder how many of those mothers may have been thinking in their head, I don't care what Moses said. I know this stuff is rotten. I know this stuff went bad again. And imagine the shock the next morning when they got up and it wasn't. And again, this shows us the miraculousness of this. And some people have tried in history to try to say, oh, well, manna was this or manna was that. No, manna was miraculous because it was something that would come every day. It's something that would expire over the night. except on the seventh day. For 6 days, it'll expire overnight, but on the seventh or 7 nights, it would expire. On the sixth night, it wouldn't. It wouldn't go bad. There's something different about it. And this shows God's miraculous sign. Again, for us who believe the Bible, believe it to be the inspired word of God, we don't have a problem with that. But there are some people who have major issues with that, trying to explain this. But there is no natural way to explain manna. And so Moses told them. And again, notice they laid it aside as Moses had told them. They listened to Moses' command this time. Remember, they didn't listen the first time. They got the manna that stank and had worms in it. This time they listened, and this time they did not stink. And there were not worms in it. And then Moses reminded the people, okay, eat it today. Now, again, he tells them, now look, you can't keep this forever. Eat it today. Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today is holy, a day of rest. And he said, today you will not find it in the field. Now, again, this tells us something about the manna. This manna would fall with the dew, but it didn't fall in the camp, apparently. It fell outside the camp. And we'll see that in just a verse 2 later. It fell outside. They had to leave the camp and go out and gather the manna and come back. And he tells them, don't go into the field. You won't find it. It won't be there today. And then he tells them, 6 days you should gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. And so he tells them again, the 6th day you're to work, and the 7th day you rest. And this was the idea of the beginning of the Sabbath. That was for Israel. And he knows on the 7th day, but on the 7th day, some people still went out and gathered it. They still went out and they went to gather it. And it's interesting, this time we don't read about Moses being mad here. We read about God being mad. And God says, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? How long? How long will you not listen? And Moses takes these words and relays them to the people. And he says, see, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. And again, he reminds them 6 days. On the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Imagine the care of God, that God gave them just enough manna every day for an omer for 2 million people. And on the 6th day, he gave them enough for 2 omers per person for 2 million people. This is very precise. And Moses says, if God does that for you, then this is what God expects you to do. God expects you to remain in your house, remain home. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day. Let him stay home. Then verse 30, so the people got it. So the people rested on the Sabbath. They rested on the 7th day. And the idea that they rested is they stayed around the tent. They didn't go out. They didn't wander. They didn't work. They didn't do what they usually did. They understood this was a day of rest. Now, God's going to later come along and lay out some more guidelines for them on the Sabbath. But for right now, it's just trying to get them to understand the basic outline of the Sabbath. Verse 31. Now, the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And Moses said to Aaron, take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The people of Israel ate the manna 40 years till they came into a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is a 10th part of an ephah. So here we have the summation of this chapter, the summation of what's happening. And this part of the story, this part of the encounter, is some information, but it's also going to tell us what happens at a later date. Happens at least a year from this point. Now notice the house of Israel called its name manna. And manna is the Hebrew for what is it? What is it? That's sort of an interesting idea that every morning went out and eat, what is it? It's like I don't know if it's still available now, but we used to have a candy bar called a whatchamacallit. And that idea, that play on words, if you can't remember what it's called, that's what this was. This originated with manna. What is it? What is it? And he says it's like a coriander seed, a white seed. It's white, and it had a taste of wafers made with honey. It had a sweet taste to it. It was something that could be boiled, could be baked, could be eaten raw. There's all different things the Israelites found to do with it. And in verse 32, this is what happens a year out. Is God tells Moses to keep an omer of it. Keep an omer of it throughout your generations. An omer so they can see the bread with which I fed you in the new wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, the reason we say this is a year out is verse 34. Because the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. Well, what testimony? You see, this is the thing in Exodus that we've not read about a testimony. We've not read about any of this. The testimony is a reference to the Ten Commandments, those 2 tablets of stone. Those 2 tablets of stone that are placed in the testimony are placed in the ark. That's why we're going to read later. The ark is called the Ark of the Testimony. And we read later that when they build the ark, they take the 2 stone tablets and put those 2 stone tablets inside the ark. And we find out later that they take a jar of manna, and the jar they use for this manna is a golden jar. And they take this golden jar of manna and put it in the ark along with along with Aaron's budding staff. Excuse me. So this is a little bit. This is not. I'm trying to think of the word here. This is not in order. This is not just follow consequential order. That's not the word I'm looking for. But it's not just sequential order. We take a break. We have a little inset here. This is an inset saying, okay, this is what God told us to do with this manna. We've talked about the manna. This is what manna was, and this is what God told us to do with it. And then you notice God says, put there to place it before the Lord to be kept throughout the generations. And then you notice verse 35 and 36 tell us a little bit of history about the manna, where we're told that here they are in the first year of their wandering. And even without knowing the story, we're told before any of this stuff happens that Israel's going to be in this wilderness 40 years. Because notice it says they ate manna. The people of Israel ate manna 40 years. They ate manna until they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Matter of fact, we read in Joshua 5:12, I believe it is, that the manna stops. When they're on the border of Canaan, right as they get into Canaan, that's when God stops sending manna, because he's got them through the wilderness. That they eat this to that point. Now, again, the interesting thing about it is this is written in a way that somebody will say, oh, well, here's proof that Moses didn't write it. This was written after the fact. No, this was written in a way that it doesn't necessarily say that the manna had come to an end when the writer wrote. He just gave the fact that the manna was coming to an end. Again, they ate manna till they came to the border. And it leaves room. And what I'm saying is the Hebrew especially leaves room to show that this event hasn't necessarily happened yet. Again, giving verification, giving no contradiction that Moses could have wrote the book, that Moses could have wrote these words, even though when he was alive, this manna was still coming. And so here we have this chapter dedicated to the manna from God. What is it? The bread of heaven. And we get here to see this beautiful Bible picture. And I call it a beautiful Bible picture because manna is one of those things that we've heard about our entire life. All the Bible, if you've studied Old Testament and Moses before, you know about manna, the bread of heaven, the bread that God fed Israel from heaven, that beautiful image. And it's very interesting because this is, again, a foreshadowing of what Christ is going to be, because Christ is going to be that bread of heaven. That bread that feeds the people, the bread that nourishes them, not nourishes them physically, but nourishes us spiritually. The bread that he will give. John 6 talks about his bread that will save people, that will give people a life. And those that eat the bread, they're going to have the eternal life. Well, he used this idea of bread that provides life as a shadow, or uses that as an implication of the shadow that was manna. This manna that God provided in the wilderness for people to survive on until they got to the promised land. And the idea for us is we have the bread of God, the bread of Jesus now, his words, his teachings that teach us, that sustain us, that fill us till we reach the promised land. That bread of heaven that we have in this earth that sustains us spiritually until we enter into that glorious home with God in heaven. What a great thought. What a great lesson to know about this manna. This manna that teaches us that God will provide. Even when things look bad, when things look horrible, when things are at their worst, if we will trust God, God will provide. And God provided for Israel. But the thing about it too is we got to remember the other lesson we can learn from this, we got to have faith in God. 2 or 3 times we've seen in this chapter where God expected the people to have faith, but they didn't. He expected them to obey him, to listen to him, to know that he would do what he said. He told them to eat it, and at the end of the day, with the night, to get rid of it. If you didn't, there's going to be consequences. What did they do? They tried it anyway, and they had bread that stank and had worms. And God told them, don't go collect on the Sabbath day. What happened? There's someone that went out on the Sabbath day. And God said, how long am I going to put up with you? We look at that and we say, how could they do that? Don't they know better? But you know, we do the same thing, don't we? There are things God tells us not to do, not to do. And we choose to do or not to do them because of how we feel, how we think, not necessarily because of what God told us. You know, sometimes we give the Israelites a hard time. We question some of their decisions. But I think if we truly look at, truly study it and read it, we'll see that Israel's a lot like us, that they have a lot of the same tendencies we have, tendencies that we have to be careful about to make sure that we don't test God, try God, go beyond what he's commanded. Appreciate you joining us here tonight. I appreciate you joining us in our study of Exodus 16. Next week, we will go to Exodus 17. And we'll remind you, if you get a chance, come join us Sunday morning. We have Bible class or have our worship starting at 10 a.m. We'll meet Sunday morning. Appreciate you having there. Also, I was told to announce that starting tomorrow, the class at 21st Century will begin again. So if you get a chance to go out and join that class, they will begin at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Appreciate everyone being here. Appreciate you helping us or attending with us. Remember, let us know if there's anything we can do to help you. But for now, we hope that you're having a God bless week, and we hope to see you again real soon. See.